Yeah, we basically shouldn't be building any new build coal at all. The latest IPCC report suggests that we need to get coal down to less than 2% of the global power capacity by 2050. So, there's really no reason to be building it at all. As you say, it's abundant. It's been seen as relatively cheap, but I guess the big news now is renewables is cheaper, and that wasn't the case 5-10 years ago. And I think that's the big change now. I think the governments are starting to recognise.
But coal is still heavily subsidised, as I understand it. Is that why it's such a challenge for you?
I think it's subsidised in most markets, and it's also just seen as the default as a kind of incumbent fuel and a default by some kind of authorities. It still forms a big part of government planning in some Southeast Asian countries. So these are decisions, and these are decisions that can be changed. I think in terms of economics, wind and solar are able to compete on a level playing field with coal pretty much everywhere in the world these days.
But only really, as you said, on a subsidy-free basis. And if there is a market mechanism, if there is pricing for carbon, for example, auctioning, and a competitive tendering process, then wind could be very competitive, yes? How far away are we from that model?
I think globally there's a transition towards auctioning and competitive tendering, and that has brought prices down for wind and solar very dramatically. Wind prices have come down by more than a quarter just in the last 3 or 4 years, and particularly dramatically in the last couple of years. We've seen wind come in very cheap in a lot of emerging market countries, in North Africa and South America, and also in Europe and also in the US. There's no reason why the same story can't be repeated in Southeast Asia, but we do need a kind of market system that allows us to go out and compete and show what we can do.
Where is that market system working?
I think it's working pretty well in most countries in Europe. I think it's working well in the US. I think it's working well in places like Brazil and Mexico and Argentina and Chile. It's become the global kind of mainstream as a system.
But it's interesting that there's some jockeying for position and some internal rivalry within the renewable space between wind and solar. From what I understand it, solar build seems to be falling, wind seems to be increasing. What's behind that dynamic?
Wind and solar are two quite different products in that one relies on daytime sunshine, one relies on patterns of wind. Wind only makes sense where it's a very windy spot. Solar makes sense in a lot of places, obviously, because it's sunny pretty much everywhere. But you need a combination of both, right? We don't pretend that you can run a whole power system globally just on wind or on solar. In fact, they're complementary, and you need different sources of power in the daytime and nighttime, depending on different resources. And you're also going to need to bring in things like storage and demand response and digital energy to be able to manage these new energy systems.
You preempted my next question, Ben. The challenge for renewables is that, correct me if I'm wrong, it cannot yet really meet base load power demand, and that's where storage solutions really come in. How evolved are they in the wind generation space, and where do we stand, and who's really coming up with the R&D and generating the new technology?
Yeah, there's several areas that are exciting. One is storage, and as we've seen, battery prices are falling very, very rapidly across the world, and there's related technologies like electric vehicles that are driving that process as well. The other is response. So old power systems have a lot of redundancy built into them. So old power systems were built on kind of redundancy in power lines, big redundancy in terms of coal power plants and gas power plants. So a lot of wastage and a lot of energy wastage, whereas renewable energy systems are basically based on an idea of a digital energy economy where power is kind of controlled and output and demand react to each other. It's kind of like comparing an iPhone to a kind of creaky old mainframe computer. And I think going back to coal, it's a 20th century power source. In fact, it's really a 19th century power source. It's old, it's creaky, it has a lot of redundancy in it, and it spews out a lot of pollution. So I think for Asia's economies, trying to move to a kind of digital economy and attract investment, it makes absolutely no sense to be doing coal, and it makes a lot of sense to be doing renewables.
Hey everybody, it's Hadley Gamble from our new CNBC Middle East Bureau in Abu Dhabi. Thanks for stopping by. Now to watch more, you can try one of the videos that just popped up on your screen. And don't forget to subscribe.